There is a kind of homelessness that lives not in the body but in the soul, a quiet ache for roots that have never been allowed to grow. For Martha and Lydia, twin sisters who had shared a womb and every hardship since, this ache was the only inheritance they knew. At 17, the world had rendered its final judgment on their childhood, the heavy oak door of the orphanage closing behind them with a sound of profound finality. They were given a small bundle each, containing a change of clothes, a stale loaf of bread, and the indifferent pity of the matron who had watched them grow from foundlings into women without ever truly seeing them. The town, a dusty collection of false fronts and wary eyes, offered no solace. They were a problem solved, a burden discharged, and the sight of them walking toward the edge of civilization, their worn boots kicking up plumes of ochre dust, was a relief to the good people who believed charity had its limits. Martha, the elder by 7 minutes, set the pace. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed on the hazy line where the parched plains met the distant, timbered hills. She was the anchor, the one who navigated the practical cruelties of their existence. Her silence was a shield, her movements economical and purposeful. Lydia walked beside her, her steps lighter, her eyes taking in everything Martha's were determined to ignore, the brittle dance of a tumbleweed, the hawk circling in the unforgiving blue, the way the heat shimmered above the baked earth, making the world seem unreal, a dream from which they might wake. They did not speak of their fear. It was a shared current running between them, as tangible as the threadbare cotton of their dresses. There was no plan, only the instinct to move, to put distance between themselves and the place that had been a cage but never a home. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the air grew thin and the land began to rise. The flat, weary plains gave way to stony outcrops and the first hardy pines, their scent a clean, sharp promise in the dusty air. It was then they heard it, a low, constant murmur that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was a sound of life, of power, of something other than the dry rustle of wind and their own quiet breathing. It was the sound of water. The sound grew from a whisper to a roar as they pressed onward, leaving the open country behind for the deepening shadows of the forest. The ground underfoot softened, a carpet of fallen pine needles muffling their footsteps, and the air grew cool and damp, a blessing on their sun-scorched skin. The trees, ancient and immense, formed a dense canopy that filtered the last of the day's light into shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was a world away from the stark, exposed plains. Here, everything felt hidden, secret, and alive. Martha, ever practical, saw the value in the change immediately, shelter from the sun, a source of water, perhaps game. Lydia felt something different. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of being enfolded and protected by the great, silent woods. The roar of the water was their guide, a singular, powerful voice in the wilderness that pulled them forward. They moved through thickets of fern and over moss-covered stones, their progress slow but steady. Finally, through a break in the trees, they saw it. A great curtain of white water, crashing down a sheer rock face into a deep, churning pool below. The spray from the falls created a perpetual mist that clung to the ferns and slicked the rocks, making everything glisten as if freshly painted. The sheer, untamed force of it was mesmerizing, a display of nature's power that made their own small struggles seem insignificant. They stood at the edge of the pool, the roar of the waterfall filling their ears, the cool mist settling on their faces and hair. For the first time since leaving the town, a genuine, unforced smile touched Lydia's lips. She dipped her hands into the bracingly cold water of the pool, the shock of it a clean and welcome sensation. Martha, meanwhile, was scanning the area with a practiced eye, assessing the rock formations, the availability of firewood, the defensibility of the spot for a night's camp. It was in her nature to build, to secure, to make a fortress out of whatever materials the world provided. As her gaze swept over the cliff face, partially obscured by the thundering sheet of water, she saw what Lydia's more wandering eyes had already noticed. A faint, unnatural line. A subtle darkness behind the cascade, a place where the rock should have been solid but instead seemed to hold a deeper shadow. It was not a cave, not a simple recess. It was a suggestion of something more, a sliver of space that seemed intentionally concealed. Lydia pointed a trembling finger. "Look," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the roar. "Behind the water." Martha's eyes narrowed, following her sister's gesture. She saw it too. A narrow ledge, no more than 2 feet wide, running along the rock face directly behind the most powerful part of the cascade. From this distance, it looked impassable, a treacherous, slick path to nowhere. But there was something about it, a hint of purpose in its placement, that held her attention. The rock around it seemed worn, not by water, but by passage. It was a path. A secret, hidden path. The idea was mad, a fool's hope born of desperation, but it took root in her mind with a stubborn tenacity. Who would carve a path behind a waterfall? And where could it possibly lead? The water was a formidable barrier, a wall of pure, kinetic energy. To step through it would be an act of faith, a gamble against the crushing force of the river. Yet, the alternative was another night spent in the open, vulnerable and exposed, with the prospect of countless more just like it stretching into an uncertain future. They had nothing to lose but the rags on their backs and a life that had offered them no purchase. The decision was made not with words, but with a shared look. It was the silent language of twins, a complete and instantaneous understanding that had seen them through years of quiet suffering. Lydia's look was one of questioning hope, Martha's was one of grim resolve. Martha went first. She shed her small bundle and tied her skirts up around her knees, her movements deft and sure. She tested the rocks at the edge of the pool, finding a series of footholds that led toward the side of the waterfall. The spray was drenching now, plastering her thin dress to her skin and sending shivers through her, but she did not hesitate. Reaching the rock face, she began to sidle along the narrowest part of the ledge, her fingers finding purchase in small cracks and crevices. The stone was slick with moss and cold as ice. The roar was deafening, a physical pressure against her ears and chest. Lydia watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She saw Martha reach the edge of the water curtain, pause for a single, deep breath, and then disappear into the white fury. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing. Then, a hand emerged from the other side of the cascade, waving her forward. It was Lydia's turn. Lydia followed the path her sister had taken, her body trembling not just from the cold but from a terrifying, exhilarating sense of discovery. The roar of the water grew with every step until it was no longer a sound but a vibration that consumed her, shaking her to the bone. She reached the edge of the cascade and hesitated, the sheer power of the water just inches from her face a terrifying spectacle. It was a living, breathing wall. Taking a deep breath that was more mist than air, she plunged through. The shock was absolute. For a disorienting second, she was blind and deaf, caught in a world of churning, freezing chaos. The weight of the water was immense, a physical blow that tried to tear her from her footing. But Martha's hand was there, a firm, grounding presence, and it pulled her through the torrent and onto the relative quiet of the ledge beyond. They stood together on the hidden path, gasping for breath, their clothes soaked through, the world muted. The waterfall was now in front of them, a translucent, shimmering curtain through which the forest beyond appeared distorted and dreamlike. The sound was different here, a deep, resonant hum rather than a deafening roar. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and ozone. The ledge, they now saw, was wider than it had appeared from the outside, and it led into a deep, protected alcove carved by millennia of water and wind. It was a secret world, a pocket of existence hidden from sight. The path continued, leading away from the falls and deeper into the rock. It was clear now that it was man-made, or at least man-improved. The stone had been deliberately flattened in places, rough steps carved where the incline was steep. Following it, they rounded a bend and the sound of the waterfall faded further, replaced by a profound silence. Before them lay a small, sheltered clearing, a perfect bowl of land no larger than a cottage garden, protected on 3 sides by the high rock walls of the cliff and on the 4th by the waterfall itself. Sunlight, filtered through the cascade, dappled the ground in an ethereal, wavering light. And there, nestled against the back wall of the clearing, solid and quiet and real, stood a small wooden cabin. It was built of dark, weathered logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a low-pitched roof of thick wooden shakes that had turned a silvery grey with age. It looked as if it had grown from the rock itself, a natural extension of the landscape. A single stone chimney stood sentinel at one end, and a small, glass-paned window faced the falls. It was the most beautiful, hopeful thing they had ever seen. For a long moment, they could only stand and stare, the sight of the cabin so far beyond any hope they had dared to harbor that it seemed an illusion, a mirage conjured by their desperate minds. It was a structure of impossible security, a testament to a life lived in defiance of the world. It was a home. The clearing was a sanctuary, untouched and serene. A few hardy wildflowers grew in patches near the cabin walls, and a small, gnarled apple tree, long untended, stood near the center. The ground was soft with years of accumulated leaf litter. It was a place of deep, abiding peace, a world apart from the harshness they had always known. Martha, recovering first from the shock, began a slow, deliberate walk toward the cabin, her eye scanning every detail of its construction. The logs were sound, the joinery precise. The stone foundation was solid, anchoring the structure firmly to the earth. Whoever had built this had been a master of their craft, building not for temporary shelter but for permanence. Lydia followed, her gaze drawn to the small details, the smooth, worn surface of the wooden door, the way the moss grew in the crevices of the chimney stones, the single, sturdy-looking bench that sat beside the entrance. There was a feeling about the place, a sense of quiet welcome, as if it had been waiting for them. They reached the door. It was made of thick, heavy planks, with a simple wooden latch. There was no lock. Martha placed her hand on the wood, half expecting it to be barred, to find this final hope snatched away. She hesitated, then lifted the latch. It moved with a quiet click. With a deep breath, she pushed the door inward. It swung open on well-oiled leather hinges, not with a creak of decay, but with a smooth, solid groan. The air that drifted out from within was cool and dry, smelling of old wood, dried herbs, and the faint, clean scent of pine resin. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed and preserved, not abandoned to ruin. They stepped across the threshold, their wet boots silent on the smooth, worn floorboards, and into the dim interior. A single shaft of light from the window cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. As their eyes adjusted, the contents of the single room resolved themselves from the shadows. It was a space of profound and simple order. Against the far wall stood a stone hearth, deep and black, with a stack of dry, seasoned wood neatly laid beside it. A simple bedstead with a tightly woven rope base was pushed into one corner, a thick, folded wool blanket resting upon it. In the center of the room was a sturdy wooden table, its surface scrubbed clean, with two simple, straight-backed chairs tucked beneath it. Shelves lined one wall, holding a collection of tin plates, mugs, and a small assortment of cast-iron cookware. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, a testament to the passage of time, but nothing was broken or in disarray. It was as if the occupant had simply walked out one day, intending to return. They moved deeper into the room, their movement slow and reverent, as if in a church. Martha ran her hand along the cool stone of the hearth, testing its solidity. It was perfectly built, the stones fitted together with an artisan's care. She looked up the flue. It was clear, capped with a grate to keep animals out. Lydia drifted toward the shelves, her fingers lightly tracing the outlines of the objects there. She picked up a tin mug. It was heavy and plain, but it felt solid, real, in her hand. This was not the chipped enamelware of the orphanage. This was the property of a person who valued things that lasted. In a corner near the bed, they found a large, sea-worn wooden chest. Unlike the front door, this was locked with a small, rusted iron padlock. Martha examined it, then went to the hearth, returning with a small iron poker. With a bit of leverage and a sharp crack, the old lock gave way. They lifted the heavy lid together. The inside was lined with oilcloth to keep out the damp. It was not filled with treasure but with something far more valuable. On top lay several more wool blankets, smelling faintly of cedar. Beneath them were neatly folded clothes, 2 pairs of men's trousers made of durable canvas, several thick flannel shirts, and heavy wool socks. They were worn but meticulously mended. Deeper still, they found tools. A good quality axe with its head wrapped in oiled leather, a small handsaw, a hammer, a box of nails, a whetstone, and a length of coiled rope. And at the very bottom, a cache of supplies, tins of salt and sugar, sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserved fruit, and several bricks of tea wrapped in waxed paper. It was a fortune. It was survival. It was a legacy left by a stranger. The discovery of the chest and its contents solidified the reality of their situation. This was no longer just a shelter, it was a fully provisioned home, a gift of impossible generosity. They worked together, moving with an unspoken rhythm, to unpack their findings. They laid the blankets on the bed, their colors muted but rich in the dim light. The tools were placed carefully by the hearth, each one a promise of what they could build and mend. The food supplies were arranged on the lower shelves, a bulwark against the hunger they had known for so long. Every object they touched felt imbued with the spirit of the person who had left it here. This was a place built on foresight, on care, on a deep understanding of what a person needed to endure. As Martha was stacking the last of the food tins, Lydia, who had been carefully refolding the clothes to place back in the chest, felt something hard and rectangular at the bottom, tucked into a corner beneath the oilcloth lining. She reached in and drew out a small, dark wooden box, no bigger than a book. It was smoothly polished, with simple, unadorned sides, and it was held shut by a simple brass clasp. It was not locked. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked the clasp open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, a packet of letters, tied with a leather thong. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, and the ink, written in a steady, elegant hand, was faded to a rusty brown. At the top of the pile was a single, unsealed sheet of paper. It was not a letter to someone else, but a letter to them. To whoever might find this place. Lydia took the paper to the window, where the light was strongest, and began to read aloud, her voice soft and clear in the quiet room. To the traveler who finds this place, it began. If you are reading this, then you are in need of sanctuary, and I am long gone from this world. My name is Abel, and I built this cabin with my own 2 hands. I came to these mountains seeking not solitude, but peace, a refuge from a world that had grown too loud and too cruel. I found it here, in the shadow of the water, and for 30 years this was my home. I had no kin to leave it to, no heir to my small kingdom. But it is not in my heart to let a good home go to waste. I believe that providence guides the weary foot, and if it has guided yours here, then this place is now yours. The letter went on to explain the workings of the cabin and the surrounding land. It told of the small garden plot, hidden by a thicket of berry bushes, where he grew vegetables. It described the best places to fish in the stream that fed the waterfall, the location of a spring with the sweetest water, and the paths he had worn through the forest to good hunting grounds. He wrote of the seasons in this hidden place, the quiet snows of winter, the explosion of life in the spring. But it was the final paragraph that made tears well in Lydia's eyes, and made Martha, who never cried, turn her face away toward the shadows of the hearth. Do not think of yourself as an intruder, Abel had written. Think of yourself as a successor. A home is not just wood and stone, it is a place that holds a life. It is my final wish that this cabin holds another life, and another after that. Take what is here and use it well. Add to it what you can. Live with strength and with kindness. Be good stewards of this small piece of peace I have carved from the wilderness. It is my gift to you. May you find here the security I sought, and the home you deserve. They stood in silence when the letter was finished, the simple, heartfelt words of a man long dead echoing in the small room. He was the unseen benefactor, the benevolent ancestor they never had. He had not known them, but he had understood their need with a perfect clarity. The cabin was no longer just a lucky find, it was an inheritance, a trust passed from one soul to another across the years. The weight of their past, the sting of their expulsion, the gnawing fear of the unknown, it all began to recede, washed away by the quiet power of this man's legacy. Martha walked to the hearth and, with methodical purpose, began to build a fire. She laid the kindling, struck a spark with the flint and steel they found in a small tin on the mantelpiece, and gently blew the flame to life. A small flicker of orange light grew, pushing back the gloom, casting warm, dancing shadows on the log walls. The fire caught, and a gentle warmth began to spread through the room, the first true warmth they had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Outside, the sun had set, and the light filtering through the waterfall had turned a deep, dusky blue. The roar of the water was a constant, soothing presence, a lullaby that spoke of isolation and absolute safety. They were cut off from the world, hidden behind a veil of water, and in that isolation, they were finally, completely free. They ate a simple meal of preserved peaches and hard biscuits, sitting at the table in the firelight, the silence between them comfortable and deep. For the first time, there were no worries to whisper about in the dark, no plans to be made for a tomorrow that was just as uncertain as today. Tomorrow was here. It was this cabin. It was this fire. It was this food. It was this peace. Later, they lay down on the bed, pulling the thick wool blankets up to their chins. The rope mattress was firm, the blankets heavy and warm. Through the small window, they could see the shimmering curtain of the falls, a moving tapestry of silver and black under the light of the moon. "We're home," Lydia whispered into the darkness, the words feeling momentous and sacred on her tongue. Martha didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and took her sister's hand, her grip firm and sure. It was all the confirmation Lydia needed. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated not by a bell or a matron's sharp command, but by the sun and the needs of their new life. They woke each morning to the ethereal, wavering light that filtered through the waterfall, a gentle rousing that felt like waking inside a pearl. Their first task was always to rekindle the fire, the hearth becoming the living heart of their home. The initial days were a flurry of activity, a joyful explosion of purpose after years of enforced idleness. They embarked on a deep and thorough cleaning of the cabin, an act that was as much about claiming the space as it was about hygiene. They swept away the dust of decades, scrubbed the floorboards with sand from the edge of the pool, and washed every plate, mug, and utensil until they shone. They aired out the blankets and clothes in the misty sunshine of their hidden clearing, the scent of cedar and old wool mingling with the clean smell of wet stone. Martha, with Abel's tools in hand, discovered a purpose that settled deep into her bones. She felt a natural kinship with the solid heft of the axe, the satisfying bite of the saw. She was methodical and patient, her movements economical and precise. She inspected every inch of the cabin, identifying small weaknesses to be mended. She replaced a few rotting shakes on the roof with new ones cut from a fallen pine, her hammer blows ringing out in the enclosed space. She reinforced the window frame and rechinked a section of the wall where the old mud had crumbled. Each task completed was a small victory, a tangible contribution to their security. She was not just living in a home, she was nurturing it, strengthening it, becoming its guardian just as Abel had been. Lydia's work was of a different nature. Following the instructions in the letter, she found the overgrown garden plot. It was a small, sunny patch tucked away behind a dense thicket of raspberry bushes, invisible to any casual observer. For years, it had been left to go wild. Weeds choked the soil, and rambling vines had all but obscured the neat rows that had once been there. With a small trowel and a hoe she found hanging in a lean-to behind the cabin, Lydia began the painstaking work of reclamation. She spent hours on her knees, her hands deep in the rich, dark earth, patiently pulling weeds and clearing away the debris of years. It was slow, quiet work, and she found a deep satisfaction in it. As she cleared the plot, she found the ghosts of Abel's garden, a few stubborn potato plants that had survived, a patch of hardy herbs, and the dormant seeds of beans and squash that, with care, might grow again. She felt a connection to the man who had worked this same soil, a sense of continuing his labor. She was not merely weeding a garden, she was coaxing a life back from the brink, tending to the future. Their life was a quiet tapestry woven from these simple, purposeful tasks. In the afternoons, they would work together, gathering firewood from the forest beyond the falls, or fishing in the stream with a line and hook they found in the cabin. They learned the rhythms of their hidden world, the way the light changed throughout the day, the habits of the birds that nested in the cliffs, the subtle shifts in the sound of the waterfall that signaled a change in the weather. Their senses, dulled by the monotonous confines of the orphanage, came alive. They learned to distinguish the calls of different birds, to identify edible plants, to read the signs of the seasons in the changing colors of the leaves. Their communication remained spare, but their understanding of each other deepened. They moved around the small cabin in a seamless choreography, each anticipating the other's needs. When Martha came in from chopping wood, her hand sore, Lydia would have a mug of hot herbal tea waiting. When Lydia struggled to turn over a particularly stubborn patch of earth in the garden, Martha would appear with a spade and work alongside her until the job was done. There were no words of thanks needed, the actions themselves were the language of their love and partnership. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Lydia took out Abel's letter again. She had read it many times, but its simple, profound kindness never failed to move her. She smoothed the worn paper on the table and read it aloud once more, her voice soft in the firelight. When she finished, Martha, who had been sharpening the axe head with the whetstone, looked up. "He was a good man," Martha said, the statement simple and absolute. "He built a good home." It was high praise from Martha, who measured the world in terms of solidity and utility. The cabin was more than just shelter, it was a reflection of its builder's character, strong, dependable, and quietly enduring. They were not just the beneficiaries of his labor, but the inheritors of his philosophy. They began to add their own touches to the cabin. Lydia gathered wildflowers from the forest and placed them in a tin mug on the windowsill. Martha built a new, sturdier set of shelves to hold their growing collection of dried herbs and preserved berries. They were making the home their own, layering their lives on top of the foundation Abel had laid. The world outside the waterfall, the world of dusty towns and indifferent people, began to feel like a distant dream. This hidden clearing was their entire universe, and it was a universe that was safe, peaceful, and entirely their own. Here, they were not orphans, not burdens, not outcasts. They were simply Martha and Lydia, tenders of the fire and keepers of the garden. They were home.